Hi guys, this is Dr. Momsilovich with your lecture 9.2 on Island Biogeography. When you normally think of an island, what comes to mind is probably what's shown in this picture, which is a small section of land surrounded by water. However, when we're talking about island biogeography, an island can actually mean quite a few different things. So islands are areas that are surrounded by a matrix. So it can be a piece of land in the middle of water, so it's land surrounded by a matrix of water. It could also be something that we call a sky island, which would be the top of a mountain, which is surrounded by a matrix of valleys. It could be a woodlot island, which would be an area of woodlands that are surrounded by a matrix of developed fields and neighborhoods and things like that. An island can also be the almost exact opposite of what you normally think of as an island. So we could consider a pond or a lake being an island of a body of water in the middle of land. And it would be considered an island in that context because the aquatic organisms from one lake or pond cannot move over that terrestrial environment to reach another lake or pond that is not directly connected. In this lecture, we're going to also talk a little bit more about species diversity, which we've talked about before. So just remember that species diversity is the number of different species in a particular area. And we're going to discuss more about how species diversity relates to islands and the size of islands. Like we talked about in our last lecture, there's a general expectation that when you have a larger area of land or water, there's going to be a higher number of species. The same rule does apply to islands, but there are some clear differences between the species area relationship on a mainland, which is a large area, and an island. Mainlands will always have a higher number of species than islands, and the effect of an increased area is stronger in islands. So in other words, the rate of increase on an island in the number of species is going to be faster than on the mainland. The theory of island biogeography was developed by two ecologists by the names of Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson in the 1960s. They developed this theory to explain why islands have fewer species than a mainland area of the equivalent size. So in other words, if you look at a 1 hectare area on a mainland, there will be more species within that hectare than a hectare on an island. And they came up with this theory to explain why that difference occurs. The number of different species on an island is dependent on two different factors. The first is the number of species that are immigrating to the island, and the other is the number of species that are going extinct, or that go extinct. So immigration is also known as the rate of arrival of new species to an island, and that rate will gradually decrease as all of the species from the species pool, which is on the mainland, arrive at the island. So you can imagine that if you have 50 or 100 different species on your mainland, it may be at the beginning of immigration a very high rate of new species making their way over to that island. But as all of those species are represented on the island, the rate of immigration of new species will decrease. The other factor that is important in determining the number of species on an island is the rate of extinction. So as more species colonize the island, the extinction rate will also increase. This happens because as you have more species on an island, more of them can go extinct. So if you start with only one species, your rate of extinction is expected to be low because there are just not as many species that can go extinct. However, as you add more and more species, you will end up with a higher extinction rate. And those species are going extinct, hypothetically, on an island because there are limited resources and they must be divided among the species, and the populations may be small because they're living on an island, and therefore it increases the probability of extinction. So extinction rate will increase over time because you are adding more and more species and their populations are likely to be small. So the number of species on any island is at the equilibrium between the immigration rate and the extinction rate on that island. The number of species on any island is what we would call a dynamic equilibrium, meaning that the numbers of species can change over time depending on the number of species that are immigrating to that island and the number that are going extinct. So that equilibrium point can move up or down depending on the number of immigrations and the number of extinctions. The number of species on any island, like we said, is related to the number of immigrations and the rate of extinction that is occurring on that island. However, there are characteristics about any island that can influence their immigration rate and their extinction rate. And that would be the size of the island and the distance from the mainland. So we would expect an extinction rate would be higher on small islands because the population sizes are generally small and small islands can support fewer species than large islands. So if you look at the graph on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see that the rate of extinction is higher on small islands compared to large islands. For immigration, you would expect more species to be able to reach a near island compared to a far island. If an island is close to the coast of a mainland, if you think about a species like a bird, if the bird has to fly to that island, they're more likely to reach a nearby island than one that is further away. So islands that are closer to the coast of the mainland should have a higher rate of immigration than islands that are further away from the mainland. We can also look at the way that those two characteristics interact with each other and affect how many species are on any island. So for example, if we look at the intersection between a small far island, which would be that first vertical line by where it says species, we would expect fewer species to be on a small island that is far away because species are going to have a hard time reaching that small island, and a small island is going to be able to support fewer species. On the other hand, a large island that is near the coast of the mainland would be expected to have the largest number of species because species will have an easier time reaching that island, and a large island can support more species than a small island. So a small far island would have fewer species than a near large island. So the theory of island biogeography is called a theory because we actually have quite a bit of evidence to support it. We have a few examples of natural experiments and a few that are not natural. The first example of island biogeography that we're going to talk about is the experiment that happened on Krakatau, which is an island in Indonesia. In 1883, the island was completely destroyed. All of the life on the island was completely destroyed by a volcanic eruption. Over the next 100 to 150 years, it was recolonized by different plant and animal species. And so we can look at the way that the numbers of species arrived at that island and how they went extinct to sort of test our ideas and our hypotheses for island biogeography. We have good information on the number of species of resident land birds on Krakatau, meaning that they live there permanently and they're not there because of migration or arrest between moving around somewhere else, and as well as plant species. So if we look at the number of bird species first, we can see that from the early 1900s to the end of the 1900s, the number of the species of birds on Krakatoa has increased as the number of colonizations has started out high and then somewhat decreased, and there's also been extinctions along the way. And so we would expect eventually an equilibrium in the number of species on that island once the number of immigrations and extinctions are at an equilibrium. We can also see that there is a variety of different plants that have colonized the island. And if you look at the graph on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, you can see that plants that have seeds that are sea dispersed, or they move along ocean currents, were the first to reach the island, which makes sense that the seeds get into the water and made their way over to Krakatoa. After that, wind dispersed species were able to colonize, and then animal dispersed. So once animals such as birds were able to colonize the islands, they were then able to bring their seeds over from plants from the mainland, and those plants were able to colonize the island. At this point, it seems that sea-dispersed plants have reached an equilibrium because that line of the number of species for sea-dispersed plants has leveled off, but the number of wind-dispersed and animal-dispersed plants is still increasing. So we still have new species of wind-dispersed and animal-dispersed plants being brought to Krakatoa. The theory of island biogeography has actually also been tested using experiments. And these experiments have been done on mangroves. So we talked briefly about mangroves when we were talking about biomes, but just to review, a mangrove is just a small shrub that grows in coastal waters. And when a number of mangrove plants grow together, they form a habitat island. This was one of those types of an aquatic biome. These are really unique ecosystems because they have their roots that are exposed to the air when the tide is low, and when the tide is high, the water covers the roots, and the roots make a good place for fish and other organisms to live. And these mangroves are usually colonized by different species of birds and insects and things like that. So two scientists, their names are Daniel Simberloff and E.O. Wilson, we talked about E.O. Wilson earlier in this lecture, did experiments on mangrove islands to determine whether there was a relationship between the size and the distance from the mainland and the number of species and the rate of immigration and extinction. So they did something that would be very controversial and probably would not be allowed today, which was taking tarps and covering different mangrove islands of different sizes and distances from the mainland. And then they used fumigation, so essentially large amounts of pesticides, to kill all of the animals that lived on those islands. And then they watched as the islands were recolonized by different species to see if their theory of the distance from the shore as well as the size of the island related to the number of species that reached there and the number that colonized versus the number that went extinct. And what they found was that depending on the size of the island and the distance from the mainland, there ended up, after 200 to 300 days, being differences in the equilibrium numbers of species on those different islands. So a large island that was near to the shore of the mainland would have more species colonize it, and a small island that is further away from the mainland actually ended up with fewer species colonizing it. Some of the importance and the power of island biogeography is that this idea of islands off the coast of a mainland can actually be applied to other things, such as mountaintops and freshwater lakes, or even fragments that are remaining of ecosystems such as forests or other previously contiguous habitat. It could be something like a cave, any habitat that you can think of. And so island biogeography actually has really important implications for conservation biology when we think of whether we need to conserve one large preserve or a lot of small preserves. It's the idea of which is better. And it comes down to this idea and this concept that has been debated for quite a long time by ecologists, which is called SLOS, and it stands for single large or several small. So is it better to have one large preserve or several small preserves? And we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail, but as you'll see, the answer is going to be that sometimes it depends on the ecosystem that we're looking at and whether it should be a single large or several small preserves. So when scientists and government officials are designing preserves and reserves, there are a few questions that we have answers to because of this theory of island biogeography. So if you look at the map of the state of Arizona, you can see all of the different protected natural areas which are shown in green. Some of them are small and isolated from other areas, and some are quite large. And it comes down to these questions of the size and shape of those preserves and reserves to determine how they should be delineated and constructed. So there are a few general principles when we're designing and determining areas to be preserved or reserved. So the first one is that a large reserve is superior to a small one. And that comes back to that relationship between area size and number of species, where a large area will be able to support a greater number of species than a small area. The second is that a single large reserve is better than several small reserves with the same total area. Next, when two or more reserves are inevitable for some specific habitat or species, the inter-reserve distance should be as short as possible. So this just means that if a reserve or preserve cannot be combined into one, the distance between those two reserves should be as short as possible to allow species to move easily between those two reserves. When you have one or more than one reserve, you should also have corridors between those reserves, and that also allows inter-reserve immigration of species that are moving within that natural habitat. And then finally, as far as the shape of a reserve, they should be circular in shape because it minimizes the dispersal distance of anywhere within that reserve. Other things that scientists have to consider when they are designing a reserve are edge effects, which is the amount of perimeter that there is to the area, so the amount of the center of the preserve compared to the perimeter of it. Some species like to live at the perimeter of their ecosystem, such as at the edge of a forest. There are several bird species that like to live in that area. Other species like to live in the center of their habitat. And so depending on the species that we're looking at conserving, it's important to know whether we need more of an edge or more of a central part in comparison. In general, it's considered better to have less perimeter and more area. So the larger that the reserve is, the more internal space there will be compared to the amount of perimeter. It's also important to consider the distance to the nearest area or the nearest preserve area. So if it's not far, so the closer the two preserves or reserves are, is better to allow movement of species between the two. The size of the nearest area is also important, so it's better to have larger reserves rather than a bunch of small reserves that make up the same area. And again, that goes back to those edge effects. And also there has to be some kind of a matrix or an ability to cross between them. Some species are perfectly okay with moving between two reserves and moving through urbanized landscapes, and others are not. So coyotes would be an example of a species that really has no problem moving through an urbanized area to get from one part of a reserved natural space to another. But there are other species that will not cross into urbanized areas. And so leaving a matrix of natural area that they can use to cross through is important for a lot of species. The last thing that we need to talk about are evolutionary trends on islands. And we actually see quite a few different trends in the ability of species to disperse, as well as changes in body size on islands. So on a lot of islands, we actually see flightlessness or reduced dispersal ability. We can see this in birds, and an example of this is in the inaccessible island rail, where they no longer are able to fly. And that essentially happens because not only is there not really anywhere to fly from an island, but it sort of also keeps them in place on that island. We also see this in insects. So an example would be the Lord Howe Island stick insect, which is a very large stick insect that has lost its ability to fly. And we also see this in different species of land snails, which are often small enough to disperse on wind currents, but they change in size, which relates to our next category, to make it so that they don't disperse as easily. We also see changes in body size where we see either dwarfism or gigantism, depending on the species and whether it's an herbivore or a carnivore and the amount of resources on that island. So we see dwarfism in something like the Madagascar dwarf chameleon, where it's something that maybe has fewer resources available to it. And so it's easier and evolutionarily better to be smaller in size because you need less resources and less energy to sustain yourself than a larger species. On the other hand, we actually see gigantism in some island species, something like Galapagos tortoises, where if they have an environment that has a lot of resources and probably no natural predators, then they're going to be able to be larger in size and become very, very large in that type of an environment.